When you think about the most powerful villains in the DC universe, your mind probably wanders off to Darkseid, Anti-Monitor, Imperiex Prime, or even Volthoom. What if I told you those beings don't even scratch the surface of power that the most powerful villain in the DC universe has? And that villain goes by the name of Mandrakk, also known as Dax Novu. Now, for us to understand just the scope of Mandrax's power, or just who he is, we have to go back to the beginning of everything, to the beginning of the creation of the DC universe, when the Presence who first created the DC universe, then created Michael and Lucifer. Before him, before creation itself, we go back into the Overvoid, or the Overmonitor. Now, for you to get a grand scope of just what the Overmonitor is, it was nothing, empty white space. Imagine this going on for an endless eternity, just white and nothing in there. And in that infinite, perfect white space, there was suddenly an imperfection, a small creation, very minuscule in the grand scheme of what the Overvoid encompasses. However, it was an imperfection inside of a perfect white space, which caused the Overvoid itself to become sentient, because this imperfection was ruining this vast eternal perfection that it had upon it. That imperfection, that DC universe, was created by the Presence himself. And in order to further understand just what this was, the Overmonitor created the being known as the Monitor. And the Monitor was to go into the DC multiverse and explore just what this was and find out what is going on here. Upon the Monitor doing so, it began to see the various stories on the pages of DC Comics. It began to see a vast, infinite amount of universes that needed cataloging and classifying. And thus, that very first Monitor became known as Dax Novu. He went around the entirety of the multiverse. He went and cataloged and named every last universe in this vast multiverse of infinite worlds. Now, you might be wondering, how did Dax Novu go from being an explorer who was exploring the vastness of the multiverse to being a villain? And that comes from the energies within the multiverse. The energy that keeps the multiverse alive and afloat is called the bleed. It's a primordial energy that feeds every universe in the multiverse. It's almost infinite in scale, just how much energy that this bleed has. And upon Dax Novu realizing this, and Dax Novu knew that this unchecked energy, this bleed, could fall into the wrong hands, and he created something called the Thought Robot. We're gonna get deeper into the Thought Robot later on in the video, but just keep that in mind. The Thought Robot was created by Dax Novu, and Dax himself began to feed on the multiverse's energy. He began to feed on the bleed, and realizing that this energy, this bleed energy, would corrupt him, and the fact that it's so delicious, it's so powerful, he put himself in a self-imposed exile, and he locked himself away. Upon Dax Novu being locked away, the Overmonitor created another being called the Monitor, and the Monitor himself was supposed to continue Dax's work. As the Monitor entered the multiverse, almost as if to create a balancing force to the Monitor, a new being was created called the Anti-Monitor. Now, the Anti-Monitor was the antithesis of the Monitor, a more corrupt version, a yang to his yin. And this Anti-Monitor became the greatest villain that DC has ever seen. And the Anti-Monitor has destroyed a vast number of infinite universes. So far in the history of comic books, Anti-Monitor has the highest death count in all of comics history, period. Just because of the sheer number of universes he's destroyed alone in his quest for power. And after the events of Crisis on Infinite Earths, the Anti-Monitor was defeated and the universes were put back into one. But as we know in DC Comics, there's always a new threat to the stability of the universe. And the one universe housing all the energies of the multiverse could not last. And it was once again split into a multiverse of different universes. With that happening in the split of the multiverse, the biggest issue that the multiverse always faced was the fact that there was always one Monitor to monitor the entire multiverse. And every time that happened, either Dax Novu became corrupt or the Monitor split into two, creating the Anti-Monitor. So therefore, there was a Monitor created for every universe in the DC universe. That way, no one Monitor could be corrupted by all that power, and they all would watch over their own universes. Now, even though in DC universe, the multiverse is always in danger, the Monitors did their job as best as they could. Now, when the being known as Darkseid decided to go on his final crusade against the multiverse, Darkseid began succeeding in absorbing the entirety of the multiverse into himself, almost to the point of being the most supreme villain in DC universe. However, Darkseid was stopped, but not before Mandrakk was freed. And at this point, Mandrakk would spend so much time in solitude, feeding on the energy of the bleed, that he became a vampire of sorts, a vampire that feeds on the energy of the bleed, losing himself completely to his dark hunger and the desire to absorb all that energy into himself. Mandrakk became the most powerful villain that the DC universe has ever seen. And he began a crusade to wipe out the entirety of the DC creation and absorb all that energy into himself. Now, remember what I told you guys earlier about the Thought Robot? Now, Thought Robot himself is fashioned after Superman because remember, when Mandrakk originally came to the multiverse to study and read these stories, because when you think of the DC universe and you think of comics in general, they're stories to us. And Mandrack's power and the scope of just how big he is, the DC universe and multiverse or megaverse, however you want to call it, is also a story to him. So in that story, there was always one hero who stood out, and that hero was Superman. So before Mandrack's corruption and his imprisonment, he had created the Thought Robot, like I said earlier. It was modeled after Superman. And the only way to power this Thought Robot is to have what I would call a duality of sorts. You need dual opposing forces, such as the Monitor and the Anti-Monitor together could power the Thought Robot. However, Superman also has an antithesis, and his name is Ultraman from the Anti-Monitor universe. And those two combined, and those two antitheses were able to power Thought Robot. And Thought Robot and Mandrakk entered a battle that of which the proportions have never been seen in DC Comics before. These beings were bigger than the multiverse itself. Imagine two beings who are bigger, taller, and feed off the multiverse. Mandrack's power is the power of the entirety of the multiverse, and Thought Robot, being a creation of Mandrack's, his ability is to match his opponent and adapt to the power of Mandrakk. When it comes to this level of power, it becomes even harder to quantify because at this point, they're fighting on such an abstract concept of fiction that it's hard to even imagine or fathom that level of power. It's one thing to be able to say you can destroy the universe. It's one thing to say you can destroy the multiverse. It's one thing entirely to be fighting outside of it all, to be above the multiverse itself. And that is the power that Mandrakk has. And the way he was defeated by Thought Robot initially is because Mandrakk himself is the opposite of life. This is where things are a little heady because you would think the opposite of life would be death. However, Mandrakk was Dax Novu. So Mandrakk is the opposite of Dax Novu. It isn't until Thought Robot reminds him of that, and Thought Robot reminds him that he was once a scientist sent by the Overmonitor or the Monitor. It's with that realization that Thought Robot was able to defeat him and throw him into the Overvoid. That's essentially having Superman fighting at the edge of the comic book. Imagine this is a comic book and Superman knocks Mandrakk off the page of the comic book. That's just how abstract and wild this fight is in itself. That just goes to show you the scope of Mandrack's power. Because throughout fiction and throughout comic books, whether it's Marvel, DC, it's always about destroying the universe, destroying the multiverse. Never does it get to the point where they're fighting on the very fabric of fiction itself. And that is the scope of Mandrakk. However, when Superman knocks him over, Mandrakk doesn't just fall off into the overvoid. He falls away from the story to the point where people forget even Mandrack's existence. Because if he's not in the world of fiction and he's lost into the vast nothingness of the overvoid, Mandrakk no longer exists. Or that's what we thought, because Mandrakk himself had his blood consumed by another Monitor, and that Monitor became another version of Mandrakk. Now, this Monitor waited until the end of Final Crisis, until Darkseid was defeated, and Darkseid was able to meld most of the multiverse into nothingness until there was almost nothing left but one speck of the known multiverse surrounded by nothing but bleed energy. And that small speck of existence was all that was left for Mandrakk to destroy in order for him to be surrounded by the bleed and infinite energy that he so craved. Now, at this point, this version of Mandrakk had not been feeding on the bleed as long as the original Mandrakk. While he was still powerful, he still wasn't on the level that he was when he fought the Thought Robot. That doesn't mean he wasn't powerful, because we have to understand the scope of this here. This version of Mandrakk, while not on that metaphysical level as the previous Mandrakk, this version of Mandrakk was able to defeat the Radiant and the Spectre. For those of you who don't know, the Spectre is the wrath of God himself, and the Radiant is God's mercy. Remember, God created the entirety of the DC universe, and the Spectre was his most vengeful spirit, the one who goes out and dishes his wrath. And the Radiant matches Spectre in all aspects of power as God's mercy. Now, the scope of these two beings' power, you should already know. The Spectre has fought the Anti-Monitor, the one who destroyed the entirety of the multiverse. The Spectre has fought him. The Spectre has fought Parallax, the one who almost destroyed all of time in the DC universe. The Spectre is always the one who meets the most dangerous threats head on. The Spectre and his equal in power, the Radiant, both confronted Mandrakk, and they both were defeated and drained of their energy. So we know this Mandrakk, while not as powerful as the original, was super powerful. He was still more powerful than any being these guys have ever encountered. At this point, without Thought Robot, for the defeat of Mandrakk, it took Mandrack's son, Nix Uton, gathering Supermen from all over the multiverse, as well as the Green Lantern Corps, as well as the Pax Day. The Pax Day are the angels of heaven, the ones who fought against and defeated Lucifer Morningstar in his rebellion against heaven, that armada, all of them combined, plus the use of the Miracle Machine. The Miracle Machine is a machine in the DC universe that grants any wish. The Miracle Machine is essentially a Deus Ex Machina. It can grant any wish within the DC multiverse to make it happen. It took all these forces to finally repel Mandrakk, and that is the scope of his power. The Anti-Monitor himself was able to fight the Spectre to a standstill, and the Spectre stood no hope in front of Mandrakk. It took the creation of the Thought Robot, it took the Pax Day, the heavenly host of heaven, the ones who repelled Lucifer, the entirety of the DC universe's fiction to repel Mandrakk. And for a being to require that much energy expended onto his defeat shows that Mandrakk stands above all other villains when it comes to the DC universe in power, because his scope transcends physical damage. His scope transcends anything you could calculate. It's primordial, it's metaphysical, it's beyond anything we could think of. It's damn near crazy just to imagine the level of power that this being has. Now, if that wasn't enough, Mandrakk has now returned in DC's Rebirth. Now, Thought Robot's out of the picture, and Nick Uton, his son, is now immortal. So it's hard to see what can possibly stop Mandrakk going forward. Anyway, guys, that's it on Mandrakk, the most powerful villain in the DC universe. If you have any questions, let me know in the comment section below. What do you think of the video? If you got any ideas of any other videos I should do, let me know in the comment section below. And if you like this video, definitely give it a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button if you haven't already, and definitely check out some of the stories that Mandrack's a part of, because those stories, even reading them, are a bit confusing to understand the scope of exactly what's going on in those stories. Anyway, guys, until next time, peace.